Mental health has been declining for years now. There are many different factors, many of which people attribute to things like social media and societal expectations that a lot of people crumble under. I'm not here to argue the direct causes of the trend of declining mental health. The causes are here to stay for the most part. So people in recent years have gotten better at recognizing when their mental health is declining. But even with the rising awareness or people recognizing it more, it's easier for people to ignore the signs that they see in themselves and the people around them. Since people ignore the present signs of poor mental health in themselves, people often fall victim to extreme mental illness and mental disorders, and it can oftentimes decrease the quality of their life and both their loved ones and themselves as well. It's important to recognize when things are changing and when you may need to help or when you may need to be evaluated. This speech is to persuade people to look deeper in themselves and those around them so that they can recognize when things are feeling out of control or when things are getting out of control so that things don't become detrimental in their lives. Addressing you or somebody else's mental health can be very intimidating or scary sometimes, especially if you're not familiar with dealing with mental health. That's how it is for a lot of people. A lot of people don't have chronic depression or anxiety, so it's not something that they deal with a lot of times, and they feel like it's easier to avoid. And this can lead them to isolating themselves from the people around them and often contributing to a worsening mental health. Identifying the causes of mental health decline is also at the top of my list for one of the most important things. So identifying whether it's depression, anxiety, things of that sort is one of the most important things that you can do for yourself. And in my opinion, the most important thing is acknowledging it in the first place, because if you don't acknowledge your worsening mental health, you'll never get to the point where you identify whether it's depression, anxiety, or something of that sort. People never get to this point because people oftentimes feel like if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, or that it'll eventually go away if they ignore it. So, for example, they might be feeling depressed, but they're like, if I just don't acknowledge it and I just continue on with life, it'll eventually go away. And this is true for certain people. In like situations like seasonal depression, it'll come and go, but that's not how it always is. And sometimes it can end up worsening and causing lifelong problems for them. And I feel like it's never good enough to risk doing something like that. For example, according to Adu Joseph, a mental illness researcher, um, untreated mental illness can have detrimental effects. For example, in Canada, mental illnesses have been found to contribute significantly to disability, affecting 1 in every 5 people. Sometimes the reason people ignore what they feel isn't out of fear, though. Sometimes there's just a lot of things going on in life. So a lot of good things might be happening. There might be, there's a lot of good news happening in your life, and you feel like maybe you don't deserve to feel the way you feel, or you feel like there's maybe just not enough time to acknowledge how you're feeling. Or like I said, there's just a lot going on in life, and they just never have time to sit down and think about how they're feeling and really just break it down. For example, a woman that recounted how she lost her son to suicide. I know it wasn't immediately afterwards. In the months following, she was going through a lot of good things like births in the family, marriages, and she never got the time to sit down and really sit with her grief. And because of this, her mental health suffered. And because she never acknowledged her suffering mental health, it started to take a physical toll on her body. And some of these physical tolls that ignoring your mental health can take in your body is things like headaches, migraines, tense muscles, heart palpitations, even stomach aches and things of that sort. These symptoms can even get so bad that they can eventually lead to things like chronic illnesses. And since we're on the topic of chronic illnesses, it's true that sometimes worsening mental health will cause chronic diseases, and it's usually because of the stress that you carry when you start experiencing worsening mental health. Stress causes a plethora of issues due to cortisol, a hormone in the human body that it uses it to regulate stress. So obviously, when your stress is haywire, you're more prone to get chronic illnesses. These chronic illnesses are things like high blood pressure, diabetes, and while it obviously isn't going to cause diabetes, it can contribute heavily to it. So if you're already on track to get diabetes, then it's not going to help you. So if you're ignoring your mental health and you're already on track to get diabetes, you're probably like about to get diabetes, if you know what I mean. It can also contribute to insomnia, so it can make it so that you're not sleeping as well, or sometimes it could be on the opposite end of the spectrum where you're sleeping a lot, like 8 to 10 hours a day, and you just never feel rested at all. And sometimes it can even be like both going back and forth, according to livehealthy.org. Symptoms can even begin to be so severe that they start to mimic very real, serious medical emergencies like heart attacks. So, for example, the heart palpitations could get so serious that it starts feeling like you're having a heart attack, and you may be going to the hospital for things like this. And these things can oftentimes lead to things like chronic heart disease. And sometimes it can even lead to things that like seizures that mimic epileptic seizures as well. Um, with that part covered, it's important to acknowledge that even if you're ignoring your mental health, it still has very real effects on your body and can lead to lifelong complications in your life. And some of these complications involve suicide. Suicide is a very, very real thing. And if you ignore your mental health, you are prone to these things. And in fact, since 2001, suicide has been on a constant rise and it has never really dipped. There are periods in time where it will dip from year to year, but there's never been like a constant decline. So it's never been like 5 years in a row where mental health is, or I'm sorry, suicide is declining. So for example, in 2019, it was about 22.4. And then in 2020, it went down to 21.9. However, back in 2021, it was 22.8, which was higher than in 2019. So although there was a dip in 2020, it's still constantly rising because 2021 is higher than it was in 2019. This goes in hand with the higher rates of suicide and anxiety in the youth as well. And it's not really just youth, it's the population in general, but you see higher rates in the youth. And suicide is what happens most in the youth as well. Um, Depression and anxiety are not the worst of it, though. These tendencies cross over into much more serious mental disorders. So things like schizophrenia and bipolar 1. I say bipolar 1 specifically and not bipolar 2 because bipolar 1 is more schizoaffective. So they experience things like hallucinations, things of that sort that schizophrenic people experience, and bipolar 2 don't really experience psychosis, which bipolar 1 people oftentimes do. About like 65% of them experience psychosis at one point in their mental disorder. I say this because although everybody that has depression and anxiety might not be schizophrenic or bipolar, these symptoms go hand in hand with schizophrenia and bipolar 1, and you can develop them later on in life. And you wouldn't know that you're developing them because you never really paid attention to what's going on with your mental health. And when these things are left untreated, they can have very, very serious issues. When they're allowed to fold in on themselves, it causes people to go through mental breaks. And if the mental break gets serious enough, you go into psychosis, a very, very extreme version of a mental break. And it can involve you hurting yourself or your loved ones. It could be mentally, socially, any kind of way you could hurt yourself and your loved ones. And it can oftentimes end in things like murder and suicide, sometimes both murder suicide. So, in conclusion, I say it's easy to pass mental off as things that are just like, oh, another depressive episode or just another bout of anxiety. But these things can manifest into very real conditions that can impact you and your loved ones for the rest of their life. It's vitally important to always acknowledge your mental health and take the necessary steps it is to get the help that you or somebody in your life may need. Okay, thank you.
Good job. Good job.
Thank you. All right.